We can be grateful that we've escaped the worst of the COVID pandemic, but it's still been a bit of a lost year with interrupted work and businesses smashed, many out of work actually, and so many families, of course, as we know, separated. Now, for me, one of its disappointments has been the way we've marked time on responding to the big underlying challenges we have as a nation. I mean, I get it. The PM is busy. The PM, along with the Health Minister, Greg Hunt, Treasurer Josh Frydenberg, all of them caught up dealing with the day-to-day of this COVID crisis. But you've got to wonder what so many of the other ministers were doing throughout this year. And look, 18 months on from the government's election win, what have those ministers achieved in their portfolios? What's happened in 2020, for example? What's happened to make our schools better, to restore manufacturing capacity, to develop a population plan, to build more dams, to make our society more cohesive? Are our taxes simpler and fairer? Is our power supply cheaper and more reliable? And what has a Conservative government in Canberra done to defend our values? Freedom of speech, religious freedom, freedom of the family, defend the family in particular, and more. Now, I'm sure you've got a view about all of these things, whether they've performed or they haven't performed, even if you also know that it's hard more and more in our country for these presidential-style governments to focus on more than one big thing at a time if the PM isn't there in the moment. That's why it's so refreshing to find that COVID has not distracted every MP from getting on with things. The Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters, one of the most consequential of the parliamentary committees, well, it has just reported on the 2019 election, and its recommendations should be taken seriously. In my view, they should be substantially implemented. You see, something else we've been inclined to congratulate ourselves on has been the efficiency and fairness of our elections compared with what we've just seen in the United States. But making the US a yardstick for electoral integrity would be a mistake and give us all a false sense that we have nothing to improve when we do, especially in regard to the reliability and accuracy of our electoral roll and the risk of multiple voting. Now, this committee is led by Senator James McGrath. He's an experienced political campaigner before he went into politics. He's also the former Deputy Director of the Federal Liberal Party. And his final report wants to see Australia implement an electronic electoral roll in time for the next federal election, which should mean that someone voting at one booth in one electorate is incapable then of voting again anywhere else. When some marginal seats come down to less than a handful of votes, multiple voting could be the difference between government and opposition. And when our lives are now more and more run by digital this and electronic that, it beggars belief that our voting system is still maintained by paper lists of who can vote in what electorate. In terms of voting more than once, I reckon it's farcical that it's not digitised. I mean, there's nothing to stop me voting again and again in a key marginal seat, because by the time they catch up with me, if they do, the seat is decided. And we know that there's been multiple cases, dozens in the 2016 election, cases of people voting more than once. But in that case, 2016, despite the multiple voting, not one person, not one, was ever convicted. Now, having each polling booth equipped with a digital copy of the roll, so something on an iPad, let's say, so that when you vote at one polling booth, you're then marked off the digital roll in every other polling booth, it's common sense. And to be honest, most Australians listening to me tonight would be asking, why isn't this in place already? This isn't the only sensible change the Electoral Matters Committee wants to see happen. As yesterday's report recommended, the committee also wants people going on the roll to provide much stronger identification beyond just a statement from one elector that says they're qualified. On polling day, it also wants voters to produce some form of ID before they can vote. Now, if you want to protect our voting system, these changes would be hard to argue against. The Labor Party, well, they're already out there today calling this an assault on democracy. Now, how can that be All we're asking is for voters to show the same sort of ID that we ask of people when they board a plane or even when they collect something from the post office. How is that a democratic assault? Ensuring our ballots are not only fair but seen to be fair, it may not be Scott Morrison's #1 priority for the coming year, but it should be. And it should be a key legislative priority too, because a bill in the Parliament next year would flush Labor out and force Labor to explain why they weren't prepared to demand greater electoral integrity. I, for one, would be very interested to hear the BS excuses that Labor might try to mount against the digital roll or against voters being made to show ID. So I'd encourage the coalition not just to talk about sensible change, but to actually get it done. Now, harder but no less interesting are some of the other proposed reforms in this committee report. 4-year terms, for example. Now, that's something I would support because turning over our federal government every 3 years means we only really get 2 years of actual outcomes, as that third year inevitably is taken up with campaigning. So that's worth a debate in the community, isn't it? And also, too, this idea that we should grow the number of seats in the House of Representatives, that makes sense. Because as our population increases, we have electorates added to keep the number of voters in each electorate, or voters per seat, roughly about the same, because that then preserves the principle of one vote, one value, meaning a vote in inner city Sydney isn't worth more than a vote in, say, country Victoria. Now, of course, there's a constitutional issue with increasing the House. It automatically means you increase the Senate. That's called the nexus provision in the Constitution. Now, because no one seriously thinks we need any more senators, breaking the nexus so you could increase the House without then increasing the Senate, that would mean a referendum. Getting up a referendum, as we know, isn't easy, but doesn't mean we don't have the fight. Another key recommendation is to bring in optional preferential voting, meaning you can just vote one. Once you've done that, that's a valid vote. You don't then have to allocate a preference to every other candidate. Even though it was Neville Wran who introduced optional preferential voting in New South Wales to make it harder for the coalition to run three-cornered contests, Labor would hate this federally because it would mean they couldn't automatically rely on Greens' preferences to get Labor over the line in key marginal seats. Still, why should people be forced to allocate a series of preferences to candidates they may be strongly opposed to if they just want to vote for one candidate in order to cast a valid vote? With the Labor Party likely to be difficult, it would be tempting for the Morrison government to use claims of expense or logistical difficulty to put off this sort of reform and shelve this Electoral Matters report like so many of the other reports have been shelved. But we elect governments, don't we, to do the hard stuff as well as the easy stuff. And given this government's miracle election win last year came with not much in the way of a forward agenda other than staying in office and, as we saw this year, doing well in beating the pandemic, I reckon the PM should grab this chance. He really should, to put beyond doubt the integrity of our elections and use his time in office to actually get some meaningful reforms done. Because while the PM has been flat out in this year of pandemic, everyone would say he's done a great job. But PM's been busy. I doubt many of his ministers have been. In 2021, that's got to change. After all, government isn't just about gaining or holding power. It's what you do with it that really matters.